tell you this history, I want you to sit with something. Everything you were taught about initiation, about manhood, about rites of passage, about what it means for a boy to become a man, was almost certainly taught to you by a culture that had already forgotten the most essential piece, the feminine. Not the feminine as decoration or as a reward, but the feminine as the initiator, as a mirror, as the force that has always stood at the threshold of masculine transformation and said, "You cannot pass through me with a lie." This is not new. This is not my invention. This is ancient, and it's deep in human nature. Let's begin in the Temple of Isis. In the mystery schools of ancient Egypt, which was not Egypt then, but a time before our known history, a time erased from our history books, the priestesses of Isis were not simply spiritual functioneers. They were initiators, healers, keepers of sacred knowledge that could not be transmitted through text alone. It had to be transmitted through direct experience, through the body, through the kind of encounter that dismantled the illusion and rebuilt the initiate from the inside out. Men who sought initiation into the mysteries did not simply study with other men. They passed through the feminine. They were witnessed by the priestesses who could see, as the tradition understood it, not only who a man was, but who he was capable of becoming. This is why, by the way, every woman on the planet can always see the potential of a man. It's in our nature. The men of the temple I come from, the temple of Isis and Lilith, from that dimension, as I write about in my books, Sex Magic Evolution, Symbol of Sex Magic, The Last Priestess, and the Sex Priestess Manual, are the brothers of the temple, and they were there to serve and to be a support to the sacred work of the women. They were magnificent men, living a life of service, honor, and were highly devoted to the sisters and to the Great Mother. Isis herself was the great initiator of Osiris, as the tale says. She who gathered the pieces of the scattered masculine and called it back into wholeness. This is not mythology to me. This is a map. Now let's move to Greece. Let's move to the mysteries and the Pythia. At Eleusis, the great mystery rites that were practiced by nearly 2,000 years, the central initiation involved a descent, a confrontation with death, disillusion, and rebirth. The presiding figure was feminine. The mysteries themselves were considered the property of Demeter and Persephone, the mothers and the underworld of the feminine, the keepers of the passage between worlds. Men, including some of the most celebrated figures in Greek history, submitted to this process, not because they were forced to, because they understood that certain kinds of wisdom could only be received through surrender to something greater than the ego. At Delphi, the Pythia, a woman was the oracle through which truth arrived. Kings, warriors, philosophers came to kneel before her and receive what they could not find in themselves. Power bowing to truth. This too is initiation. Let's move to indigenous and tribal traditions. Across indigenous cultures on nearly every continent, rites of passage for young men were not exclusively male spaces. Elder women, mothers, grandmothers, feminine ceremonial leaders held critical roles in the process. The boy was often released from the care of the feminine world specifically so he could learn to stand on his own. But the feminine was always present at the threshold through which the passage was made. In many traditions, it was understood that a boy becomes a man not when he defeats something external, but when he faces something internal. And the feminine in her elder, in her ceremonial role, in her function as the living earth itself, was the mirror in which that internal reckoning took place. The temple tradition I come from. Now let's move to the temple of Isis and Lilith. In the tradition that I carry, the priestesses were never separate from the initiation of men. They were its heart. A priestess was not a passive presence. She was a force, trained, embodied, rooted in a level of self-knowledge that allowed her to hold space for the most difficult truths without flinching, without rescuing, without collapsing. She could see the wound and the greatness simultaneously. She could challenge a man to rise without humiliating him. She could love him enough to refuse his performance and demand his truth. That is what I carry. That is what I bring to the threshold. That is the lineage this work is built from. This is not a modern experiment. This is a remembrance, and I am bringing it back to humanity. A remembrance of something the world once knew and has nearly lost. That the deepest masculine and the deepest feminine do not compete. They initiate one another. They call one another forward. They cannot fully become themselves in isolation from each other. The threshold is not about women teaching men how to be men. It is about restoring an ancient relationship between the masculine and feminine, the relationship that exists not as hierarchy, not as opposition, but as the original mirror through which both become more fully themselves. And we need men and women to be fully themselves right now as the mother is rising. Now, are you ready for the threshold? Only 20 men, an ancient truth restored. If you feel the lineage of this calling you, begin your application at the link below. I love you so much. The mother is rising. Please subscribe, like, and share so I can continue making these videos and share the work of the temple. And may the goddess bless you all.